This is a special report from CBS News.
Good evening. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News headquarters in New York. Well, at its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba. But there has been no confrontation as far as we know, and some hope has been generated by suggestions of negotiation. The latest bid for a peaceful settlement came tonight from U Thant, the acting Secretary General of the United Nations. He told the Security Council that he had sent duplicate appeals to Soviet Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy, and then he read his message.
I have been asked by the permanent representatives of a large number of member governments of the United Nations to address an urgent appeal to you in the present critical situation. These representatives feel that in the interest of international peace and security, all concerned should refrain from any action which may aggravate the situation and bring with it the risk of war. In their view, it is important that time should be given to enable the parties concerned to get together with a view to resolving the present crisis peacefully and normalizing the situation in the Caribbean. This involves, on the one hand, the voluntary suspension of all arms shipments to Cuba, and also the voluntary suspension of the quarantine measures involving the searching of ships bound for Cuba. I believe that such voluntary suspension for a period of 2 to 3 weeks will greatly ease the situation and give time to the parties concerned to meet and discuss with a view to finding a peaceful solution of the problem. In this context, I shall gladly make myself available to all parties for whatever services I may be able to perform.
Tonight, on this circuit, we have our chief Washington correspondent, David Schomburn, our White House correspondent, George Herman, our Pentagon correspondent, Charles von Fremd, and our United Nations correspondent, Richard C. Hotley. It is our proposal to talk with these four correspondents about today's developments. Dick Hotlett, over at the United Nations, is there optimism now that something might develop from this U Thant proposal?
Walter, there's a considerable relaxation of tension measurable here at the UN. It began last night when Mr. Zorin did not make half as concretely fearsome a speech as he might have made, but and it continued during the day with a very heavy emphasis on negotiation as a possible way out. Also, of course, buoyed up by the fact that nothing has happened on the high seas in Berlin or any of the other danger points. But interestingly, U Thant's appeal tonight probably did not carry on the prospect of negotiation as far or as quickly as he might have hoped, because American sources here say that they think rather little of it. They don't take too hopeful a view of it at all. And they do that for two reasons, because his appeal for a voluntary suspension of Soviet shipping and a voluntary suspension of the American quarantine measures at the same time strikes American sources as another pig in a poke, another uncontrolled moratorium in which we shall once again take the word of the Soviet Union that ships are not carrying arms into Cuba, or that other ships under Russian contract aren't, or that the arms buildup in Cuba isn't continuing in one way or another. The United States, as Adlai Stevenson made clear in an extremely bitter speech yesterday, is just not going to take the Soviet Union's word for anything ever again, and the matter of UN observers to assure that the arms buildup offensively in Cuba is continuing, this demand for observers is going to be maintained. The second point that I think has somewhat cooled American hopes on the U Thant initiative is that while the United States has worked very hard to get the United Nations into this picture from the first, seeing the UN as a sort of third man, as a buffer, a cushion between the two great contending powers, U Thant has become a factor of his own here. He has stepped out into the public, and if he has taken sides, as Americans think he has taken sides on a substantive issue, this neutral position of behind-the-scenes maneuvering, behind-the-scenes encouragement has perhaps gone out of the picture.
Dick,
So
let's find out what they think down in Washington now. David Schoenbrunn, how about the White House attitude toward this U Thant proposal? Do you have any clues?
Yes, there's very little enthusiasm down here, Walter. There are some indications that the president may already have replied in a very cool fashion. They don't ever like to turn the UN down flatly with a refusal. They're very sensitive to world opinion down here, as of course you know, but there's no liking for this proposition. What they're saying to us down here, men who have been very close to the president on this, is that his proposal does not go to the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is that missiles and missile launching pads already exist in Cuba, whereas all U Thant is asking is there be a 2 to 3 week freeze. Now, this freeze will work to our disadvantage. The president said in his speech on Monday night, and he's going to repeat this to U Thant, I'm told, that what he seeks is the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of this threat. U Thant does not address himself to that at all. There's no liking for the proposal that he's made, and Washington's extremely frigid about it.
I wonder over there at the White House, where George Herman has been standing out in the cold most of the evening waiting for us to get on with these opinions, what the attitude is. Have you had any feeling tonight, George, whether there is even a speck of optimism there?
A speck of optimism, I think, even that moderate phrase would be too strong for what there is here. If I could go back a little bit to what Dick Hotlett said a few moments ago and what Dave Schoenbrunn said, I don't think that the White House believes that the UN can, by its very nature, get at the heart of this problem or be a proper buffer in this problem, because as far as I can see, as far as the White House is concerned, Cuba isn't really the problem. It's just the preliminary. The real problem remains Berlin, and Cuba is to a large extent, not completely of course, but to a large extent viewed here as a preliminary test of our will and our strength before Berlin, and the real problem is still Berlin. I refer you to what, and I have been, it has been suggested to me that I refer you to what the president said in his speech. He referred to many months of trial, and there's some indication here that the trial on Berlin might come in late November, early December. And I can see no optimism of any kind here that the United Nations can, by its very nature, be of any help in what is, after all, as far as can be seen, a test of our will. If we resort to some third party and say, come in and save the situation, we have not proved very much about our will and our credibility as a deterrent nation.
George, are you suggesting that that would have to be the administration attitude, that it could not back down at this point with third-party intervention, that we must go to a complete test of wills now?
I am not saying we cannot back down, but I'm saying that when we do back down, or if we do back down, even if it should be via a face-saving arrangement at the United Nations, when we do, or if we do such a back down, we will have weakened the credibility which we have been trying and are still trying to establish by our actions over Cuba. And I might add, on the question of immediate relief or optimism here, that nobody in the White House is willing to say that any Soviet ships have turned back. They do not believe that the 24 hours of waiting is over. There's still considerable belief here that it might be possible that the confrontation in the Caribbean will come yet tonight.
Let's check over the Pentagon with Charles von Fremd on that. Chuck, is there any late information about the position of those Soviet ships or what might be happening to them?
Walter, we haven't heard a word for several hours now as to when the confrontation between U.S. vessels and the Soviet ships will come about. This just points up again that we're only a little way along the first step of this great undertaking which the President launched us on Monday. The people here in the Pentagon are quite tense. As you know, the military is subordinate, of course, to civilian direction, and the feeling here is that we have a long way to go before we're out of the woods. The people here at the Pentagon look particularly toward point 6 of the President's 7 points that he made on Monday night, which calls for the breaking down and withdrawal of all offensive weapons, before this quarantine can be ended. The all-offensive weapons at the Pentagon also includes those light jet bombers which the Soviets have shipped, as well as the much more publicized missiles and the missile pads. Also here at the Pentagon today, we went back on a wartime security guidance system for the first time since the Korean War, a 12-point program in which all civilian and military personnel working for the Department of Defense have their lips sealed. From now on, we're under what amounts to virtual censorship here at the Pentagon, which points up again the severity with which the situation is viewed here.
Walter?
Yes.
Can I come in on what Van Fremde said and what the White House has said? It's very clear from everything that we're told down here that we will not make any kind of a deal or any kind of a negotiation unless we have an absolute guarantee that the agreement will be carried out. And that would mean what Mr. Stevenson suggested at the UN yesterday, that at the very minimum we will demand a UN observer team in Cuba to make sure those bases are being dismantled. Now, Castro has said he wouldn't permit it. If that's the case, then the president's answer to Utah, the final answer, will certainly be no.
Do you think there's any possibility, and we might address this to Dick Hoddlett, that Castro might accept a neutral observer, as has been suggested Brazil might offer to be, rather than an official UN observer? Is it that he would not accept any observation on his home territory?
The first indications, Walter, are that the objection is to any foreigner coming in and in some way impinging on the sovereign rights of Cuba by going and looking around under some foreign authority. And here again, the American sources here draw the parallel between the whole nuclear testing issue, which again has foundered not on the nature of the neutral inspection, which is designed to rule out cheating and violation of a given word, but on the fact itself. The Russians don't object to a non-neutral team as against a neutral team. They object to any team, and the indications are that the Cubans will hold the same position in this regard.
Gentlemen, you've each made the point on the relative value of Berlin and Cuba in this crisis, but I'd like to ask the question from the layman's standpoint. It seems to the observer of the scene that Cuba has to be the point of the crisis. This is the point at which we are concerned that there might be shooting among the ships at sea, that in the story that we heard a great deal of today, the possibility that invasion might have to be undertaken to assure that those bases are eliminated. If invasion is undertaken, the Russians have said that they would retaliate with rocket fire. We have said if there's rocket fire from Cuba, we will retaliate, and there goes the whole ball game. So how do we relate Berlin as the major crisis when the shooting war could start tomorrow over Cuba?
Walter, I could speak to that, Walter, since I made such a point of the Berlin crisis.
Right, George?
I think it is perhaps a mistake to think of this as a crisis. This is not a simple world we live in any longer. When you have a world polarized into two camps, they do not work on simply one front. I think if you go back over the history of recent weeks and months, you'll find, for example, that on the end of September, I think September 28th, the Secretary of Defense, Mr. McNamara, returned from the trip to Berlin and did something rather unusual. He called an immediate news conference, as you may remember, within a few hours after he returned. And he started talking about our nuclear-armed forces in Germany. Now, this is very unusual. This was quite a striking departure. We've never before made a point of it. And he also said, and you made quite a point of it on one of our shows, that Berlin was the worst crisis since Korea. I think at that time, the administration began to be aware, or at least to conclude, that the Russians now have decided to make a real issue out of Berlin and to move ahead. And then I think you have
George,
to... I got just one other point on this.
George, I regret that we don't have time for even another point.
Go ahead.
It looks as if our report from our correspondents is that there is not a great deal of reason for optimism tonight. That's the report from the CBS News staff. This has been Walter Cronkite from the CBS Newsroom in New York.
This has been a special report from CBS News.